Poland has been erased from the map 3 separate times, not conquered, not occupied, completely deleted. And each time it came back. It built one of the largest empires in Europe, created the first modern constitution on the continent, and at one point stopped the Soviet Union from conquering the West. So how does a country survive over 1,000 years of being invaded, partitioned, and repeatedly wiped out? This is the story of how Poland refused to disappear. In the year 966, a pagan duke named Mieszko I stood at the crossroads of Europe and made a decision that would echo for centuries. He accepted baptism not just as a matter of faith, but as a calculated move to pull his patchwork of tribes into the orbit of Western Christendom. With a Bohemian princess at his side and papal protection in his corner, Mieszko forged the first outlines of a Polish state. The rivers and forests of Greater Poland became the heart of a new kingdom, its boundaries expanding through conquest and alliance. His son, Boleslaw the Brave, pushed further. By 1025, Boleslaw wore a crown, the first king of Poland. His coronation in Gniezno was more than ceremony. It was a declaration that Poland would stand among the kingdoms of Europe. The new monarchy reached to the Baltic, tied itself to the Holy Roman Empire, and opened its gates to trade, culture, and the Latin faith. Castles rose, towns flourished, and the names of Polish rulers began to appear in the chronicles of the continent. But the unity that Mieszko and Boleslaw built did not last. After Boleslaw's grandson died, the kingdom fractured. In 1138, Boleslaw III's testament carved Poland into hereditary duchies for his sons. The result was a land divided, a checkerboard of rival courts, each jealously guarding its own power. For nearly 2 centuries, Poland ceased to be a single kingdom, becoming instead a loose federation of feuding Piast dukes. The central crown faded, and with it the power to resist the storms gathering on the steppe. In 1241, those storms broke. The Mongol horde swept in from the east, burning, killing, and leaving whole towns in ashes. At Legnica, Polish knights and their allies made a desperate stand. They fell. The Mongols did not stay, but the devastation they left behind was total. Villages vanished, fields went untended, and the population plummeted. The land was left open, vulnerable, and divided. The very existence of Poland as a nation seemed to hang by a thread, its unity lost, its people scattered, and its survival no longer certain. Yet even in this darkness, the idea of Poland endured. Monasteries kept the language alive. The memory of kingship lingered in the minds of dukes and peasants alike. The story of Poland's first erasure was not the end. It was the beginning of a pattern: loss, survival, and the stubborn refusal to disappear. In the aftermath of devastation and division, Poland did not fade into memory. Instead, it began to gather its scattered strength. By 1320, the crown returned, this time on the head of Władysław the Elbow High. His reign and the even more ambitious vision of Casimir the Great set the stage for a new kind of power. Casimir rebuilt shattered towns in stone, founded the University of Krakow, and welcomed Jews and Germans alike, turning Poland into a magnet for trade, learning, and new ideas. The kingdom's borders stretched outward, absorbing Ruthenian lands to the east and Silesian towns to the west. But the real transformation came not from conquest alone, but from alliance. In 1385, the Grand Duke of Lithuania, Jogaila, agreed to Christian baptism and marriage with Queen Jadwiga of Poland. With one stroke, 2 crowns joined. The Polish-Lithuanian Union created a state that dwarfed its neighbors, a realm that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea, a shield against the Mongols and the Teutonic Knights. When the Teutonic Order marched to destroy this new power, it was met at Grunwald in 1410 by a coalition of Polish, Lithuanian, and Ruthenian banners. The knights broke, their myth of invincibility shattered in the mud and blood of the battlefield. What emerged was no ordinary monarchy. The Commonwealth, formalized by the Union of Lublin in 1569, was a republic of nobles, a vast federation where kings were elected, not born. Every new monarch, starting with Henry of Valois in 1573, faced the scrutiny of the Szlachta, Poland's famously proud nobility. Here, the Warsaw Confederation guaranteed religious freedom for Catholics, Protestants, Orthodox, and Jews at a time when the rest of Europe burned with intolerance. The Sejm, Poland's parliament, wielded real power, and the liberum veto gave any noble the right to halt legislation, an experiment in liberty that would one day become its curse. For nearly 2 centuries, the Commonwealth stood as Europe's largest state, a patchwork of languages, faiths, and peoples held together by law, privilege, and the uneasy balance of its ruling class. Its armies rode east and west. Its scholars debated in Latin, and its cities thrived on trade from Gdansk to Lviv. From the ashes of fragmentation, Poland had become a superpower, its greatest age, and the dawn of the flaws that would one day threaten its very survival. The storm broke in 1648. Cossack banners rose in the east, led by Bohdan Khmelnytsky, igniting a revolt that turned the Commonwealth's breadbasket into a graveyard. Battles raged from Zhovty Vody to Korsun, and by the time the treaties were signed, whole towns lay in ashes, and the population of Ruthenia had fallen by nearly 1/3. The grain that once fed Europe rotted in burned fields. The treasury bled dry, the army starved, and the Commonwealth's borders began to dissolve from within. Before wounds could heal, another disaster swept in. In 1655, Swedish armies poured over the border. They called it the deluge, a flood of steel and fire that swallowed city after city. Krakow, Poznan, Lublin all fell. At the height of the invasion, 4 out of 5 Polish towns were under foreign occupation. The Swedes torched churches, looted palaces, and left Warsaw a skeleton of blackened ruins. State revenue collapsed by nearly 40%. The countryside emptied as famine and plague followed the soldiers' boots. Poland's golden age was washed away in 6 years of chaos, leaving a country gutted and humiliated. Out of this ruin, the nobility clung to their ancient privileges. The liberum veto, meant to protect freedom, became a weapon for paralysis. In 1652, one noble's protest ended an entire session of parliament. Over the next century, the veto was used again and again, sometimes 30 or 40 times in a single decade, until the Sejm could barely pass a law. Foreign ambassadors handed out bribes, knowing a single voice could silence the entire nation. While Russia, Prussia, and Austria built armies and centralized power, the Commonwealth argued itself into impotence. Yet reformers still fought for Poland's soul. Hugo Kołłątaj and his allies in the 4-year Sejm pushed for change. On May 3, 1791, they unveiled a constitution, Europe's first, the world's second, abolishing the veto, promising hereditary monarchy, and dreaming of a modern state. But the neighbors saw danger, not hope. Within a year, Russian troops marched in, and the old order's defenders tore up the new laws. The first partition came in 1772, the second in 1793, and the third in 1795. Each time, more land vanished, more rights were stripped away, until there was nothing left. Poland was not conquered, not occupied, completely deleted from the map. For the next 123 years, there would be no Polish state at all. But the idea of Poland would not die. Poland vanished from the maps in 1795. Borders erased, government dismantled, the name itself forbidden in the courts of Vienna, St. Petersburg, and Berlin. Yet the nation did not die. It became an idea carried in language, in memory, and in song. Across 3 empires, Polish was banned from schools and official documents. Underground teachers risked exile in Siberia to keep the language alive. Secret printing presses produced forbidden poetry and history, smuggled from hand to trembling hand. In the countryside, families whispered the old stories at night, while city salons became gathering places for conspirators and dreamers. The Catholic Church, stripped of its privileges, became a guardian of national identity. In Warsaw, Krakow, and Lwów, children learned to call themselves Poles, even as their passports claimed they were Russian, Prussian, or Austrian subjects. Exile became a rite of passage. After failed uprisings in 1830 and 1863, waves of refugees poured west to Paris, London, and New York. By the dawn of the 20th century, nearly 2.5 million Poles had crossed the Atlantic, building new lives in Chicago, Detroit, and Milwaukee. In exile, they formed societies, newspapers, and schools, all in Polish. The diaspora became a second nation, one that kept the dream of return alive. Art and music became acts of resistance. Frédéric Chopin, forced from his homeland at 20, composed his greatest works in Paris, mazurkas and polonaises that echoed with longing and pride. His funeral in 1849 drew crowds of Polish exiles, mourning not just a composer, but the spirit of a vanished country. Chopin's melodies, filled with the rhythms of Polish folk dances, became a secret anthem for the stateless nation. In drawing rooms from Vienna to New York, his music reminded the world that Poland still lived, if only in the hearts of its scattered children. Even under foreign rule, the Polish idea endured. Students recited banned verses by candlelight. Peasants wore embroidered shirts with hidden national symbols. Underground universities taught history that official textbooks denied. The very act of remembering became an act of defiance. For 123 years, there was no Polish state, yet there were always Poles. When the great empires finally collapsed in the chaos of the First World War, the world discovered what Poland had never forgotten. A nation can be erased from the map, but not from history. Independence returned to Poland in November 1918, after 123 years erased from the map. Józef Pilsudski stepped off a German prison train and took command of a land battered by war, partition, and occupation. Warsaw's streets filled with banners and hymns, but the new republic was born surrounded by enemies and uncertainty. The ink on the Act of Independence was barely dry when the Red Army surged west. In the summer of 1920, as Soviet divisions closed on Warsaw, Pilsudski gambled everything on a counterattack. The miracle on the Vistula, August 1920, turned back the tide. Polish cavalry charged, Soviet columns broke, and Europe's eastern frontier held. The Treaty of Riga in 1921 fixed new borders, bringing 27 million citizens into the Second Republic. For the first time in generations, Poles chose their own government, rebuilt schools, and debated their future in a parliament of their own making. Yet the dream was fragile. In September 1939, the nightmare returned. At dawn on the 1st, German troops smashed across the western border. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, crushed Polish defenses in weeks. On the 17th, Soviet armies invaded from the east, slicing the country in two. There was no help from allies, no time for a stand. By October, Poland was gone again, partitioned, occupation, and subjected to a regime of terror. Nazi occupation meant forced labor, mass executions, and the systematic murder of 3 million Polish Jews. Soviet rule brought deportations to Siberia and the silencing of every voice suspected of loyalty to the old republic. 6 million Polish citizens died between 1939 and 1945, 1 in 5. Whole towns vanished, villages emptied, and families erased from every record but memory. Resistance never stopped. Deep underground, the Home Army formed, the largest clandestine force in occupied Europe. In August 1944, as Soviet tanks approached the city's outskirts, General Tadeusz Bohr-Komorowski gave the order: Warsaw would rise. For 63 days, outnumbered and outgunned insurgents fought street by street, house by house. The Soviets waited on the far bank of the Vistula. The Germans answered with fire and demolition squads. By October, the uprising was crushed. 200,000 civilians were dead. 85% of Warsaw lay in ruins, a capital reduced to ashes. Poland was not just conquered, it was annihilated, its people scattered, its cities erased. Yet even as the war ended and a new foreign-backed regime took power, the memory of independence and the will to return survived beneath the rubble. The pattern held: erasure, survival, and the stubborn hope that Poland could rise again. In the ruins of war, Poland's freedom was a memory, not a fact. Soviet-backed communists ruled from 1945, stamping out opposition, jailing priests, and silencing dissent. The old dream of sovereignty seemed out of reach. But beneath the surface, the spirit of resistance refused to die. In the factories of Gdansk and the shipyards along the Baltic, workers grumbled, then organized. In June 1976, strikes flared in Radom and Ursus, met with tear gas and batons. The regime cracked down, but the whispers only grew louder. A turning point arrived in 1978. A Polish cardinal, Karol Wojtyla, became Pope John Paul II. His first pilgrimage home in June 1979 drew millions into the streets. He spoke not in slogans, but in the language of dignity and hope. "Do not be afraid," he told the crowds. The message rippled through the country. For the first time in decades, people believed change was possible. The following summer, the fuse was lit. In August 1980, workers at the Lenin shipyard in Gdansk walked off the job. Their leader, an electrician named Lech Walesa, scaled the shipyard fence and demanded the right to organize. The strike spread like wildfire. Within weeks, over 700 factories joined in, paralyzing the regime. The government, cornered, signed the Gdansk Agreement. Solidarity was born, a legal, independent trade union with 10 million members, 1 out of every 4 adults in the country. For the first time in the Eastern Bloc, a mass movement stood openly against communist power. The state struck back with martial law in December 1981. Tanks rolled through city streets. Leaders were arrested, phone lines cut, curfews imposed. But the movement bent without breaking. Underground presses churned out leaflets. Secret meetings kept hope alive. Even in prison, Walesa's name became a symbol, whispered from Warsaw to Wrocław. By the late 1980s, the communist system was crumbling across Eastern Europe. In Poland, the government could no longer ignore Solidarity's strength. In February 1989, regime officials and opposition leaders gathered for the roundtable talks. The result was semi-free elections in June 1989. Solidarity swept the vote. Tadeusz Mazowiecki, a Solidarity advisor, became the first non-communist prime minister in the Eastern Bloc. Walesa would soon be president. The Iron Curtain cracked, then collapsed. Poland raced into a new era. On March 12, 1999, it joined NATO. 5 years later, on May 1, 2004, it entered the European Union. The old dream of belonging to the West became reality. The Polish flag flew in Brussels and at NATO headquarters. In a single generation, Poland had moved from dictatorship to democracy, from isolation to integration. The story had played out once more, erased, occupied, denied the right to exist, then reborn through the stubborn will of its people. Not by armies, but by workers. Not by decree, but by the courage to say enough. Poland returned, again and again, until the world had to recognize it could not be erased. Today, Poland stands at the heart of Europe, a nation once erased, now shaping alliances and borders. Its survival is not legend, but ongoing reality, a country that returns when history says it shouldn't. As new threats test old frontiers, Poland's story warns that identity outlasts conquest. Some nations are written in ink. This one is written in iron. Join the conversation. What does resilience mean to you?